I just came out of Starbucks and it got crazy windy, so I bet it's about to get stormy and awesome out here. What's up? This is Joshua, MVA Studio, driving through Minneapolis. I want to talk a little bit today about some of my everyday methods for teaching and planning classes. I teach two sets of classes. There are standard multi-week programs or courses that are like things that anybody would be familiar with. Intro to typography, advanced typography, advanced project studio, or senior project or senior thesis, or whatever it is. In those kinds of classes, it's largely a problem-solving issue. What's the goal or the outcome? And then how do I make sure that I can do my part to see students go in that direction? But there's this other body of teaching work that is workshops and special topics, basically. So tomorrow I will teach a workshop that is called DIY Project Management. Last month I taught one that was called Smarter, Faster, Cheaper, Workflow Hacks for Graphic Designers. Next month, I will teach another one that is called Portfolio Expansion for Graphic Designers. Those are one-night workshops, though sometimes I finagle them into two-day workshops. Typically, the idea that they're about is, here's a thing I have figured out through practice that I think could be helpful to other people. And I teach them through MCAD. And what happens is MCAD says, do you want to do a design innovation series? And I say, yes, here's some ideas. Or they say, hey, you haven't done this set in a while. Those to me are my favorite things to do because they're very immediate. It's only a 3-hour course and the feedback is immediate. If the content is useful, it's immediate. And because you're only teaching it once, as long as you give your all, that class tends to be valuable. So the immediacy to them is really great. The way that I come up with the ideas, though, is typically I scroll through my YouTube channel and I look for what's interesting or what I found really valuable. And once I commit to whatever set makes sense, the very first step, if it's something I haven't done before, or if it's something I'm planning on redoing, because I do that a lot, is I start rehearsing what that class will be like. So for the class I'm teaching tomorrow, for the last maybe 3 weeks or so, I get in my car in the morning on my way to the office and I just start pretending I'm in that class and running through it. I don't mean it's not in my head, and it's not even really rehearsing. It's a way of me figuring out what's in the class, or it's a way of me figuring out what I should be doing in the class. Because if I run out of things to say, or if I run into an awkward moment where I'm like, shit, what happens next? That's a sign that, okay, you've got to work through this and figure out what is going to happen here. Or if it takes roughly 45 minutes for me to get to the office and I'm running through this class and I'm already, say, downtown Minneapolis, which is probably 20, 25, 30 minutes into that drive, if I'm at that point and I feel like I have yet to dive into the content, that helps me understand, like, okay, you're talking too much, or you're explaining too much, or you're doing too much preamble. So that process, that's super helpful to me, and that's the more productive way for me to work, because it's this real-time feedback. I used to work on the content in a very kind of intense way first. So it's like, whether it was 3x5 cards or notes or whatever, but I would work out what all the content was. And what I found is that it was so hard for me to figure out what was going to go where, and then you're trying to memorize how it's going to flow. Instead, what I do is I just figure out how this thing is going to flow, and it helps me know what kind of stuff to kill. I do that for about a week. Then I start thinking about the actual details, like what slides do I need, what do I absolutely need to cover, what kind of handouts do I need to make, all of that kind of stuff. And then as I'm moving towards the actual workshop, it's just this back and forth between still doing that, like that figuring it out rehearsal thing, and working on the deck. Now, one of the reasons that I do this is I never want to be in a position where technology can hinder me from doing my job. I want to be able to show up and have it be like MCAD's AV system can go absolutely haywire, and I can run that workshop with no technology as long as I have a whiteboard and can talk to people. Hold on. I'm gonna go get a coffee. That strategy of this active creation and rehearsing has served me really well, I think. One of the things is it's just made me way more comfortable with public speaking and the like. So a thing that is funny is when I do a more formal kind of public speaking, like if I have to hold a microphone, my hand can't stop shaking. And what's odd is that while my hand is shaking, I'm not actually nervous about this situation. It's like an involuntary response. It's happening, I accept it, but it's this really strange sensation because of the fact that actively I'm not freaked out about it. But that comes in large part from sitting in my car like a jackass, talking out loud to no one. Two other things that I try to do. One of the things that I try to remember is that the one night workshop has this really clearly defined beginning, middle, and end, and I need to be working towards that and planning it out. And I think one of the things I've realized over time is that the ending of the class is kind of the hardest piece, but it really matters because of the fact that when that person leaves, especially at 9:30 at night or 9:45, what they're going to remember most is that last chunk of it. So I've been putting a lot of effort into making sure that it ends clearly and in a manner that's strong. And one problem that I tend to have is I just want to give so much value that I might let the class kind of stretch out, because I'm like, you know what, we could look at this, and like, you know, there's this other thing. And I think one of the things I really have to get comfortable with is just stopping and being like, all right, thank you, any questions, and then boom, letting it be done. And then one last piece is the importance of that creative deck. This past week I've been on vacation and I've been working on the deck for tomorrow's workshop really heavily. And what's weird is I was actually supposed to go to Rhode Island and we canceled it, and it's sort of like, thank God we didn't go, because it's eaten up a lot of time formulating and designing that presentation, because as you're designing it, I'm discovering or remembering more stuff that I hadn't thought of. In the same way that talking it through is going to bring a bunch of stuff to the surface. So does that act of just designing it, which isn't shocking or surprising to anyone, I'm sure. So I put a lot of effort into the presentation decks. There's a couple reasons that I do that. One is I use the presentation deck as a trigger. You know, there's these rules that you don't want to make these super text heavy decks that, one, they just say what you're saying, but then two, they just encourage the person to read and not pay attention to you. But I have to confess that to a certain extent, I ignore that because of the fact that the deck is telling me what it's time to talk about. When the slide comes up, the slide is a trigger for content. And in some instances, it's just an image and I know what I'm supposed to talk about. And in other instances, it's a quote. I suppose I don't make the most text-heavy slides on the planet, but sometimes I make a really text-heavy set of slides because that's what the content demands. But there's a couple reasons for that, and one of them, beyond the slide being a trigger that tells me what to talk about, because I don't want to have presenter's notes, and I don't want to have 3x5 cards, and really I don't want to have to memorize anything. If the deck has something on it that is a quote, well, cool, I'm just going to read the quote off the deck. And if the point of the deck is just to trigger me talking about something, so it's only got one word on it, well, that works too. One of the things, though, I want is that if someone gets that deck, that they get value out of it. So I don't want it to just be clever visual punchlines to things that I'm saying. I want it to be content that is useful to the person who gets it with only a minimum number of slides that are indecipherable without me being there. So the idea is that I'm making a tool and a piece of content. And this saves me from having to get stuck in the world of rehearsal hell. And then the last thing is, even though I could teach a lot of these workshops without a deck, I could easily teach most workshops using an outline or 3x5 cards and writing on a whiteboard, which is a thing that I did early on. But to me, having the deck, even if it's just something that when you walk in the classroom, it's a slide with the name of the workshop, it helps create a vibe. It helps make this thing feel like an event. And that's one of the reasons that I do it as well. And then lastly, hold on, let's get past this corner. And then lastly, having those decks ready to go means that when I have to teach a workshop the next time, it's drastically easier and has less friction. When I used to teach stuff off my head and off notes, I'd have to dig up these notes, I'd have to make sense of them, I'd have to kind of relive the experience to remember it. But if I find a deck, I can just look through it and be the wisdom of hindsight. I can figure out what stuff maybe doesn't need to be there anymore, or which stuff needs to be added to it. But to me, it's the curriculum is just sitting there. So that's really helpful. And then lastly, one of those benefits of having those decks is that I can record video of the class, and sometimes it's really bad. The workshop last month, I framed up some of the screen and I framed up the podium with a laptop, and then it turns out that I don't stand directly behind the laptop at that angle. I need some room. So the video is basically a laptop with his hand occasionally gesticulating in front of it. Not great. But having that presentation deck, when I edit the final video or edit chunks of it, I can export that deck as JPEGs and I can pop those in. And now I've got something that while it's not as great as it could have possibly been, it's still good. It still gives you something to look at besides a dude behind a laptop, or besides a hand behind a laptop and the slides in the background. It's one of those things that it pays dividends over time. That's a bit of the background in terms of how I develop ideas for things and how I execute on it. All right, thanks a lot for watching. I hope you found some value in that, and take it easy.